All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our July community call hosted by the ORCID US community and ORCID-CA. Our topic today is PIDs for increasing research visibility and representation. Persistent identifiers, just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about PIDs. But we're going to be looking at how persistent identifiers like ORCID and other identifiers help increase visibility and representation in the research and scholarly communication ecosystem. Some introductions. I'm Sheila Rabin. I'm the lead strategist for research infrastructure programs at Lyrasis in the US, which is the home of the ORCID US community. My colleague, Paolo Guhilde, is our senior strategist for the ORCID US community. And then Kayla Ramhit is our ORCID US community specialist. So we're all on the call today. And then we also have our colleagues at ORCID Canada, which is led by the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, or CRKN. John Aspler is the manager for the Canadian Persistent Identifier community, and Nicholas Lamar is the Canadian Persistent Identifier Community Officer. And I will hand it over to John briefly to say a few words in French.
Juste pour vous dire, comme d'habitude, que si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, on vous invite à le faire. On peut le traduire au besoin. Just to say, if folks want to ask their questions in French, happy to translate as needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Okay, so this is the agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, I already mentioned PIDs for increasing research visibility and representation. So we're really going to be looking at what is the problem that persistent identifiers are trying to solve. Why is visibility and representation important? And how are we actively using PIDs to help with this concept of visibility and representation? And before we dive in, I do want to say that we started planning this topic for discussion over a year ago. And I feel like right now, especially in the US, with all of the uncertainty around research funding and also various constraints at federal and state institutions, it seems even more relevant and meaningful for us to discuss this topic. And I think many of us are here and doing this work that we do because ultimately we want to support the creation and sharing of knowledge in order to make people's lives better. And so to do this, there's a lot of research activity taking place, in the US, in Canada, all over the globe. And it's easy for research outputs, research findings to get lost in the mix, not to mention the many different researchers, organizations, regional perspectives, and resources that contribute to the creation of this knowledge. And so what we're really grappling with is how do we ensure that all relevant, diverse contributors, relevant knowledge, things like facilities and other resources are equally visible, represented accurately, discoverable, and included in the scholarly record. And persistent identifiers are one aspect of that bigger question that we're going to dive into today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to John. We're going to go through kind of a presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So John, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sheila. So, before we dive deep into the main topic, I just wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page here by providing us all with a brief definition of persistent identifiers or PIDs. I know that if you're here, you almost certainly have more than a passing understanding of what PIDs are because we're talking about a fairly nuanced topic inside the world of PIDs. But even so, I think it's helpful to ensure a baseline shared understanding. So, just briefly, a persistent identifier or PID is a globally unique digital string of characters that constitutes an enduring link to any entity capital E or thing capital T associated with research. Like an ORCID ID is a PID for people, scholars. A ROR, a research organization registry identifier, is a PID for places or universities, institutions. And digital object identifiers, DOIs, are PIDs for research outputs like publications. So we have PIDs for people, places, publications, and they are connected all together in this complex web. This is what that sort of complex interconnected web looks like or might look like. You have many different people publishing together, apart, with different parts of different grants connected to different research outputs and all kinds of things like that. So ultimately, PIDs aim to disambiguate identity. So we want to uniquely say that this is the correct John Aspler right over here. They also help connect entities together. So this is John, and this is his list of publications. That's an ORCID ID pointing to a list of DOIs. And perhaps most importantly, PIDs enable the interoperability of metadata associated with those entities and with those PIDs across a variety of systems and platforms. But of course, I think you likely know all of this. So let's pivot toward not only the problems that PIDs are trying to solve in general, but how the way that PIDs work as described here, what they have to do with representation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So ultimately, in making each entity more identifiable and connected, PIDs make everything and everyone more visible. So individual scholars, for example, those perhaps especially those in underrepresented regions or disciplines, they become easier to identify and connect to their work. Their work becomes more findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, fair, which Caleb will talk about in a bit. And all of those connections are happening across a variety of perspectives, backgrounds, regions, languages, disciplines, and importantly, life changes. Things change in a person's life, and the way we refer to them and refer to their work over the course of that life changes. So I guess what I want to say here is that that's kind of a lot of high level jargon to say that PIDs point to things and help us identify them. But I want to tell you a story to more clearly articulate what sort of the stakes are today and what the focus is when we talk about PIDs visibility and representation. This is an anecdote that I heard from a member, and I think it really gets at the heart of this. Essentially, this one time I was talking to a member who said that they had a colleague who wished that ORCID had existed in the late 90s or early aughts because she was a successful researcher who'd been publishing for years under her married name. She had changed her last name upon getting married, and then at some point she had gotten divorced. But unfortunately, for the sake of the recognizability and the success of her career, she couldn't go back to or start publishing under her previous name. She had to stick with her married name. So what we're seeing here is that there's a serious gendered concern around naming conventions and the way that we refer to scholars over time. ORCID, as a PID that came into existence in 2012, this person basically said that she wished that ORCID had existed at that time because it would have helped resolve a lot of those problems. She could have gone back to publishing or started publishing under her previous name. And inside her ORCID record, she could have still connected to all of the different publications she had across both periods of publishing under different names. There's even a section in ORCID to point to different versions and variations of your name. Without that, when we're just identifying people by name, it introduces serious gendered challenges for, in particular, women or trans people publishing across the lifespan. So while PIDs are foundational to a functioning digital research ecosystem, and I could buzzword at you all day about the various ways they connect together, I think it's in these specific kinds of stories, the lives of people and the institutions at which they work, that you're going to understand and hear today why and how PIDs being connected to the topic of representation matters and how PIDs can support challenges associated with representation and visibility. And with that, I'll hand it over to Paolo. Sorry, Paolo, you're muted.
Thank you. All right. So thank you, John. All right. So on the next slide, hopefully you can hear me now. Okay, great. So issues like name variation, especially for minority researchers, are not uncommon. So this is just one of the considerations researchers think of throughout their career. Without proper attribution, it leads to the lack of visibility and representation. So as Jen mentioned earlier, the significance of our conversation today is to gain better understanding of the researcher, their research activities, their outputs, and the relationship between the entities in the research and scholarly communication initiatives or ecosystem. In particular, we're going to focus on PIDs, or persistent identifiers, and how PIDs mitigate issues such as the lack of visibility and representation. So ultimately, we really want to make sure that through PIDs, the researcher, their research, and the information in between is fair, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, we know that on the next slide, we know that standing out in a crowd of researchers can be difficult. And this is even more so. Standing out in a crowd as a minority researcher, for example, is even more difficult than what it is right now. On the next slide, we're going to see a recent data published by the Chronicle of Higher Education in the United States. So what we're seeing here is that minority faculty are not represented in the organization, especially if you take into account the total minority student population at the university or higher education. So representation is certainly lacking. And then the next slide, this is also a similar trend in Canadian universities. So visible minorities or racialized people. So these are faculty who are minority populations other than indigenous people, comprised of just above about 20%. So between 2016 and 2016. This data, as well as the previous slide, puts into perspective challenges minority faculty and researchers are facing in their own organization. So potentially this has an effect on the visibility of the researcher, of their research activities and their research output. And we can see on the next slide that in 2022, a study published by Georgia Tech researchers, they found that Black, Latino, and women authors are underrepresented in many STEM fields and often appear as authors only in less cited fields. So their analysis of the data suggested systemic inequities of the value of the work and their distribution of resources in organizations. So beyond researcher visibility and representation, research visibility and representation of the disciplines are also issues faced by faculty and researchers. Now, on the next slide, we know that diverse researchers and inclusive organizations help ensure that voices and knowledge of underrepresented and historically excluded groups are visible and represented in research. Now, on the next slide, this brings us to open infrastructure and the Scholarly communication ecosystem. So this code about PIDs for instruments, for example, and how it makes it easier for under-resourced institutions to discover and access instruments can be applied to any PIDs out there. So it is true for ORCIDs when we talk about PIDs for individuals. It is true for DOIs when we talk about PIDs for objects. PIDs help to level the playing field of representation. So it's lowering the barrier of entry to inclusion in the research landscape. On the next slide, we're going to see this applied to local and regional scholarly communication initiatives, especially in open scholarly communications. It is making research and researchers visible and represented across the globe. For example, Brazil established Scientific Electronic Online, or SciELO, and we probably all know what that is at this point, but SciELO is now heavily used in different regions of the world. The Africa PID Alliance launched Digital Object Container Identifier, or DOC-ID, to capture works and heritage materials in Africa and have it available beyond the continent. And in Indonesia, it publishes close to 20,000 open access journal through Open Journal System, or OJS. So it is an open manuscript submission system. So by the way, that 20,000 journals translate to almost 50% of all journals using OJS. That's a lot. That's a significant number. So on the next slide, we can really think about the local creation of knowledge. It has a larger global impact on the dissemination of knowledge. We can think of knowledge as a public good. And with that, the importance of visibility and representation within and outside the imaginary walls of research. So at a touch of a button, what's local is now global because of open infrastructure such as ORCID, Crossref, DataCite, ROR, and many others. And finally, on the next slide, visibility and inclusion should be the norm in the research life cycle. We know that research data are lacking because there's a lack of representation in the study itself. We know that there's a lack of diverse researchers, and we know that lack of inclusion in research in particular resources and funding opportunities continues inequities in the creation of knowledge and to the access of knowledge. However, we also know that there are PIDs, principles, and infrastructures, and my colleagues will talk more about them in the next few minutes, that all of this connects entities within the scholarly communication ecosystem and can be used to move the needle. And now I'm going to pass it on to Kayla.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So Paolo just gave us some insight into why PIDs can be used to increase visibility and representation. So let's learn how we can use them. One of those ways is by following the FAIR principles. So Paolo and John mentioned this earlier, but FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the FAIR principles were created to address a need to improve infrastructure supporting the reuse of scholarly data. So if you haven't heard of these principles before, or you're asking yourself, what do the FAIR principles have to do with PIDs? Let's start by going over each part of that FAIR acronym. So as I said, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. For information to be findable, metadata and data should be easy to find for humans and computing systems. To be accessible, a user who has found the data must be able to know how to access it and is able to access it. To be interoperable, the data needs to be integrated with other data, and the data must be able to work cooperatively with multiple types of workflows and applications, such as for analysis or storage or processing. To be reusable, the data and metadata should be well described so that others can replicate it or combine it in different settings. So what does all that mean exactly, and how do PIDs fit into the picture? Next slide. So the FAIR principles take into account persistent identifiers. If metadata is assigned a persistent identifier and explicitly includes the identifier of the data they describe, it satisfies the findable part of FAIR. If metadata is retrievable by their identifier, it satisfies the accessible part of FAIR. Open persistent identifiers, so like ORCID, DOIs, ROR, for example, are interoperable, and the metadata schemas of open PIDs can help optimize the reuse of that data, satisfying the reusable part of FAIR. So why does all that matter? Next slide. The FAIR principles are all about how you can track and access data and metadata, while PIDs are the connections and bridges between people, systems, organizations, and research. When PIDs are used in data and metadata, it can make information more visible and better represented in the discovery landscape. But in order for PIDs to have the best impact, the PID metadata needs to be well maintained, well described, and updated. The quality of that data is crucial to how effective PIDs are and to how fair they become. So in order for that data to be reusable, it needs to be as rich and credible as possible. So let me show you an example. Next slide. In order to explain this, we're going to apply FAIR to the research lifecycle. So a researcher with an ORCID ID writes a paper and publishes it in a journal article. When they publish their paper, they provide their ORCID ID, a persistent identifier, to the publisher, who creates a DOI, another persistent identifier of that paper. This DOI stores as metadata a resolution location for the most recent version of the work, which will ensure ease of access and citation. Since the researcher's ORCID ID is present as metadata in the DOI of the work they published, their publication record can be easily pulled and added to their ORCID profile, thanks to the use of the ORCID API. That record now appears in the work section of their ORCID record. Finally, a funding agency can pull metadata from the researcher's ORCID profile using the ORCID API and acquire all the publication metadata, which helps the researcher from having to fill out forms, for example. So applying the FAIR to that framing, if I have an ORCID ID and my ORCID record is updated regularly with DOIs of my works, my university can access my data for reporting on the work I've done. My articles can be found with DOIs. They're searchable on the internet and can be accessed through their persistent links. So the information in my record, the work I've done, is both findable and accessible. This information is also interoperable. My DOIs can be added to my ORCID record, which is a reservoir for all my information, where my university can now access and pull that data to be used in, as I mentioned before, reporting workflows, tracking, and that's all through the use of the ORCID API. So as long as I keep my data up to date, it can then be reused effectively by my university for their reporting purposes. And that was a very quick overview. I've only barely scratched the surface of FAIR and of PIDs. So if you're interested or want to learn more, I recommend reading these blogs that are linked in the slides, and I'll share those links in the chat. But for now, I will pass things back to John.
Thank you so much, Kayla. So now we're going to be diving into specific PIDs and the way that they are tied to visibility and representation. I'll be focusing on the question of names, and specifically names for people, or ORCID IDs, the PID that represent people, and names for places, or ROR IDs, the PID that represents institutions. I've already told you some stories about gendered concerns and naming conventions with ORCID, so we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram from ORCID. What's in a name? I think that's really the most important question that ORCID IDs and ROR IDs aim to resolve. And an important thing to know is that names are a terrible way to identify a person. Most names are not unique. I usually tell a story about how, so my name, John Aspler, is unique. There are maybe 100 other people in the world with my last name. Almost all of them are at least distantly related to me. And there are no other John Asplers certainly publishing, never mind existing. But my father, Joseph Aspler, he's an academic, he's a chemist, he's published papers. And that therefore, sometimes when you publish, you're not using your full name, you're using an abbreviation or an initial. So both of us have published under the name J. Aspler before, which means that very occasionally I get emails from academia.edu saying, we think we found your paper, and it's not mine, it's a paper of my father's from the 1980s. And that's just with two people with similar names. Never mind the tens of thousands of people with names like John Smith and Deepak Gupta and Anne-Marie Tremblay, who are all publishing with the exact same name and the similar ways of representing those names. So names are a terrible way of identifying people. This is why we have PIDs. When it comes to visibility and representation, though, there is a lot wrapped up in that, tied to not just gendered concerns like the story that I told you, but also tied to culture, naming conventions. Do you do first name first or last name first? Tied up in the alphabet that's being used, tied up in the language of the person's name of origin. Is there a translation of their name that they're using for whatever reason? So it's more than just tied to gender. ORCID and naming conventions are implicit on racialized concerns, ethnic concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess what I really want to say here, and maybe briefly to answer Shlomi's question in the chat. Shlomi's asked a question about maybe we'll be moving toward using PIDs rather than names at all. There are publishers right now who have emerged with policies, in particular in response to trans naming conventions and trans identities, the idea that a person would like to change entirely the name that they have published under. There are publishers who have policies to address that, but I'm not aware if those policies specifically address the PIDs underlying that information. Do they just change the metadata on the landing page for the article? Do they go back and change the metadata in the PID? I don't know that I have a good answer for Shlomi other than to say that possibly, but at the same time, there's a lot of work that's already out there that uses names, and we need to find effective ways to ensure that the PID reflects any naming convention that a person would like to change their name to or address with their name. So this is all to say that names are tied up in many, many different elements of identity. And when we're talking about representation and the fact that people change their names and the way they use their name over time, PIDs can help us make sure that we're always pointing to the right person. Next slide, please. So before I hand it over to Nick, my colleague Nick, to speak to stories about ROR and identity, it's not just PIDs themselves that help support representation. It's also the PID registration organizations. I'm going to talk about ORCID specifically, but DataCite has a program like this. They all really try to address challenges in equity and representation. So ORCID has a program called the Global Participation Program that has two branches. The first is the membership equity program. Essentially, what that means is that institutions in low to middle income countries pay less to join ORCID as member institutions. That hopefully helps to ensure that institutions that might not otherwise be able to afford connecting ORCID to their systems and ensuring the visibility of their scholars can now do so. The second branch, the Global Participation Fund, this is more about funding specific projects in specific regions. For example, an outreach program in a specific country that again might be underrepresented or from a lower middle income country. but it also helps to fund development of software integrations, and that can be happening anywhere in the world. A fairly recent GPF call from 2 years ago, Lyrasis successfully won to help improve the integration of ORCID into DSpace. This is the most commonly used institutional repository in Canada, but of course, it's also significantly widely used around the world, especially in the global south. So any development work that's being done here ultimately benefits everyone everywhere to ensure that PIDs are more effectively integrated into the various platforms around the world. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nick. Next slide.
Thanks, John. So now switching to PIDs for places instead of names. And in this case, we have ROR, the Research Organization Registry. And what it does, it's really a continuity of what we just heard of from what ORCID does for names. So not only is ROR integrated with ORCID now, so we have a greater interoperability between researchers and their affiliations, but ROR also helps solve similar cases of name ambiguity for research organizations despite the commonness of their name. Next slide, please. So, for example, if we take two large Canadian universities that have very common names globally, we get hundreds of results. And that can be very challenging when you're querying the registry or the API, because not only is York and Western very common in universities or research organizations' name, but it can also be a geographical place because you can search the role registry by location. So ROR includes additional information in their metadata, like the type of organization that it is, the URL of that organization, and its location. So we can distinguish between these really similar records, not only because they have similar names, but also based on the additional metadata that is included in the record. And even if you think you have a unique name, like McGill University, you may get many different results because McGill has different affiliated organizations, and then ROR also captures this parent-child relationship, and all of these related organizations have ROR of their own. So that's actually really great for discoverability, and also because always know exactly what place entity you're referring to, even though they're related, because of these additional distinguishing fields in the metadata. Next slide, please. Another way that is beneficial and that ROR helps disambiguate organizations is through its linguistic diversity. So ROR offers four different metadata fields that capture information about names. So we have the primary form of the organization name that is on top of that record. We have translations that are captured through labels, alternate versions or previous versions of an institution's name that's captured through aliases, and then we have acronyms as well. So organizations' name in ROR appear in more than 120 different languages, but because ROR was built from the GRID database, um, it inherited this English language name default. So this sort of inherited data is now being actively reviewed and being changed to non-English primary names when requested. And that could be really key for organizations. For example, like here in Quebec, we have Francophone institutions that need to have their primary name in French, which is not only very important, I guess, like currently, historically, but also it's crucial to their own identity as a Francophone institution in a Francophone province. So if we see here the Université de Montréal in the record, we can see the English translation that's captured as a label, University of Montreal. Even though it is not the official name and it's technically incorrect, it still appears in the record. So this translation is just meant for greater discoverability and to make sure that everywhere we encounter that name variation, if and when it is used or misused, is always associated back with the Université de Montréal record. And if we can see here in the ORCID record, and thank you, John, for allowing me to capture your Université de Montréal affiliation. I don't know if it's a bit small here, but you can see that in the ORCID record as well, the ROR appears as Université de Montréal, and that's really key here. One exception to this is that primary names, that field can only support Latin characters, or at least for now. So for example, if we see Japanese characters or Chinese characters, like in the University of Osaka, the Japanese characters will appear as the translation, as the label for that organization. But I'm pretty sure that in Japan they use that exact name to identify themselves. But then again, the English name is there not only because of the greater discoverability that it offers, but also because of technical obstacles at the moment. So ROR really emphasizes that multilingual support is key not only for discoverability, but research visibility too at large. greater representation and inclusivity of various institutions, but it also respects how certain institutions decide to identify themselves according to the languages or the language of their choice. And that's also key for bilingual organizations, especially like here in Canada. Like if we take our organizations, for example, CRKN, we were able to curate our ROR record so that every single possible iteration of our name will always point back to us. We have Canadian Research Knowledge Network, Réseau Canadien de Documentation pour la Recherche, and both of our bilingual acronyms. So wherever whatever is used to refer to us, it will always point to the same place or organization entity. So we don't have to worry about certain things not pointing back to us. This also highlights a ROR curation challenge, especially for Canadian government agencies at the federal level, because they are all supposed to be bilingual. So here we have, the case SSHRC versus NCAN. So SSHRC is one of the major funders in Canada, and NRCan is Natural Resources, which is a government entity. SSHRC, for example, in their ROR record, added their bilingual email domain or bilingual URL and domain, but NRCan didn't, and this has caused major issues with NRCan's ORCID integration because it affects tracking their organizational affiliations because it's not the correct bilingual domain. So here we're kind of advocating that if greater discoverability and interoperability is the key to having proper PIDs, then it's more than beneficial to capture this language diversity in your ROR records. Next slide, please. The last point I want to sort of address for RORs is that it also assures continuity of names, like ORCID does, and also enables traditionally overlooked organizations to claim a space for themselves in the research ecosystem because it includes a wide variety of research organizations. So on the one hand, ROR supports renaming in the case of organizational name changes. So we have a case here of the Toronto Metropolitan University that was previously called Ryerson University, and there was a big push to rename the school that began with Indigenous students and staff petitions because Edgerton Ryerson is one of the architects of the residential school system here in Canada. So, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation in its commission and values, it was deemed not only appropriate but necessary to change the name of that university. And so with ROR, you can capture that through aliases, like the alternate and previous versions of an institution's name. So Ryerson, as you can see here, is still in the TMU's record, but it's not the official name anymore. So it really ensures the continuity of the institution's history so that all of the affiliations that were previously entered under Ryerson, say in ORCID, are not lost and now point back to TMU and Toronto Metropolitan University. And we might see these types of initiatives more and more in the future. So it's good to know that there's already a system in place to help capture these changes persistently through time. And then on the other hand, it also supports reclaiming by identifying organizations around the world that may not be immediately recognized as legitimate or traditionally been recognized as legitimate or may otherwise have been excluded in traditional academic spaces. So let's say we have Indigenous universities here in Canada, and that may be more obvious because it's higher education, but it's really important to have these identifiers, to have these names, sometimes in Indigenous languages as well, to generate more visibility for Indigenous research, their missions and values, and to share the various ways in which Indigenous communities can engage with research and traditional knowledge, and to have that acknowledged in the PIDS ecosystem already is maybe or perhaps a way forward in respecting the First Nations principles of OCAP that we have here in Canada, or the care principles of Indigenous data governance. And not only are RORs attributed to higher education and research organizations, but it's also being attributed to sovereign Indigenous governments and leadership organizations. So in the US, we have the Cherokee Nation that has a ROR, and then in Canada, we have the main government bodies for Indigenous peoples also recognize in ROR. So the Assembly of First Nation, that's a national advocacy organization for First Nations in Canada. We have the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, that's the national Inuit organization that represents over 70,000 Inuit in Canada, and that's based on self-determination as well. And we have the Métis National Council that represents the Métis Nation and governments nationally and internationally. So these are just small yet very valuable ways in which PIDs like ROR make visible traditionally overlooked researchers' work and their affiliations, and also supports diverse and underrepresented individuals. So through more and more use and implementation of PIDs, this becomes the norm, and then it becomes even more and more possible through through different languages, time, places, and also name changes. And then I'll head it back to you, Sheila, I think.
Okay, so we've talked about people, we've talked about organizations. When it comes to works and outputs, we create outputs so that they can be shared and reused, but they have to also be discoverable before people can know about them and reuse them. So DOIs, or digital object identifiers, I think many of us are already very familiar with those. They've been around for a long time. So DOIs are a really common way to identify and represent various types of works and also resources of various kinds. And DOI metadata is open and often indexed across multiple different discovery services. So for example, DataCite in particular, um, if a DOI is registered as findable, the metadata from those DOIs are indexed in all the different services that you see here. Clarivate, Mendeley, Dimensions, ProQuest Summon, Scholix, which is for kind of linking publications to data sets. And there are several applications that use Scholix within them, and also Google dataset search for data sets in particular. So, DOIs are a good kind of tried and trusted way to make works, other types of outputs and resources more visible and discoverable for other researchers and other people in general. And of course, all of that discoverability works best when, I think it was mentioned earlier, the metadata needs to be maintained, it needs to be complete. So things like descriptions, subject terms, and also related identifiers, which is the crucial point of linking various related works and entities together, are included in that DOI metadata. But then there's also the acknowledgement that, perhaps not every data set and not every work needs to be open or needs to be discoverable by as many people as possible. And that kind of brings us back to the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. I know the CARE principles have been mentioned a few times so far, but for researchers or contributors specifically working with Indigenous communities and gathering or managing Indigenous data, the CARE principles are just as important to consider as the FAIR principles, to ensure that Indigenous communities' rights are respected. And the underlying goal for CARE is that expectation that Indigenous communities have that autonomy to decide how to manage their data and their resources, including whether or how to apply the FAIR principles and the use of PIDs. So that's just another consideration to keep in mind. And then also PID best practices are going to vary based on the area of study or discipline. There are some identifiers that are primarily used only in certain areas of study. Some examples of those are like the IGSN, the International Generic Sample Number, for like physical samples used in the sciences, RR IDs, or research resource identifiers, for organisms, but also software tools and databases. There are also ARCs, or archival resource keys. I know those can be used in many different settings. I know several museums, for example, that assign ARCs to the works and resources that they manage. Um, and, in the interest of reproducibility, we need to be able to identify the various samples and the resources, and also the instruments and facilities that are being used during the course of research as well. There's an initiative funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation and kind of spearheaded by some of our colleagues at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, that's focused on FAIR facilities and instruments. So figuring out what are the best practices for assigning persistent identifiers to instruments and facilities. At NCAR in particular, for example, they have different airplanes and different instruments that they send up to gather atmospheric data, and how do they acknowledge that? How did they cite that in the data that comes out and make it available so that other researchers can, understand the context in which certain data was created or came from. And I've got another quote from a paper that recently came out of that initiative, which is that assigning PIDs to instruments and facilities could lead to a more equitable allocation and use of resources across the research landscape, which is particularly important for operators of core facilities on university campuses that want to ensure that their facility is known by all possible users. So we're seeing this recurring concept of needing either a person or an organization or an output or an instrument or facility to be identified so that it can be visible in the research landscape and help towards this broader goal of creating new knowledge. And then last but not least, we have more overarching projects where all of the entities we've spoken about can be tied together under one umbrella for activities related to a project. So you may have heard by now of a new persistent identifier for projects called RAID, which stands for Research Activity Identifier. And these graphics kind of help illustrate what RAID is trying to do. So you can connect like ORCID IDs and DOIs together. For example, RORs can be in DOI metadata and ORCID ID metadata. But what if you have a really big complex project with a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations, a lot of outputs over time, maybe even receiving multiple grants over the course of a 20-year project or something like that. RAID is coming in to help be that overarching umbrella that can tie all those things together for the purposes of identifying and making visible projects and how all of these different entities work together within that context. And then this graphic over here is just showing kind of the different nodes. You can't really see it that well, but this one says project, and we have identifiers for the people, for the grants, for the outputs. Up until now, we haven't had an identifier specifically for projects. So we're hoping that RAID will help fill in some of the gaps and help us get a better mapping or idea of how to represent accurately activity that's taking place in the research and scholarly communication ecosystem. And I will just end by saying we are doing a pilot of RAID right now in the US with some grant funding from our National Science Foundation. So if you are interested in learning more about RAID, feel free to let me know. And I think that brings us to some time for discussion and questions. I am going to make it so that people can unmute and share in the discussion. So please stand by. Okay, we can open up the floor for questions and comments. Great. Okay, I'm seeing some things in the chat so far, so maybe we want to just kind of recap what's been said there in the chat. There's a discussion about, is it better to just use ORCID IDs? Names are hard. How do we grapple with that? I think that's remaining an open question. I don't know if anybody has additional comments on that one. Linguistic diversity, absolutely. And some comments about the RAID pilot. Most funders, at least in the US, are not assigning PIDs to grants. Does this mean that most grants will not be included in RAID records? That's a really good question. We are still trying to get more adoption of PIDs for grants to help fill in all of those blanks. I don't think it's necessarily a bad sign or that grants won't be included in RAID records. it's just kind of an indication of the next steps that are cut out for us in terms of, in this community call, I know most of us are probably mostly focused on ORCID, but just the importance of all of the persistent identifiers and trying to move adoption forward for all of them together is just going to be really important for getting that inclusion.
Maybe I can just very quickly add for our Canadian viewers here, especially those in Quebec. So the FRQ, the Fonds de Recherche de Québec, has officially adopted cross-ref DOIs for grant IDs, and they have registered them going back to 2019. They have also are about to, as part of their next major cycle of applications, launch, well, they've already technically launched the ORCID integration, but of course the major funding cycle starts this fall. And they are going to be tying those grant IDs and getting those pushed into ORCID records. So funders can do this. FRQ is the first and only one doing this in Canada. We are working with federal partners. We are working with other provinces. But anyway, if any of you are working with funders and would like to see your funder do this, you can certainly take the FRQ's work back to them perhaps and see what can happen.
Yeah. I just also put a link in the chat for anyone who is even remotely interested in learning more about RAID. We have a form that you can fill out and to get on our US RAID pilot listserv, and it's open to anyone. You don't have to be in the US. And let's see, what would be the difference between a RAID identifier and an award project number? So yeah, basically an award project number is just for that specific grant or that specific award, whereas RAID is for the project. So in some cases, you could have a grant award that is a one-to-one relationship with the project. Like this grant is this project, and they're kind of the same thing. And you would just have a project identifier and a grant identifier. Some of the metadata would be a little bit different. The RAID metadata would be more focused on the project, whereas the grant identifier would be focused on the award itself, like what was the dollar amount, who received it, those kinds of things. RAID also has some unique aspects of the metadata that are different from other identifiers in that it's designed to capture project information and changes over time instead of just one set of this is what it is. It's like this person was involved in 2005, but maybe isn't involved anymore. Those kinds of things.
And like just to add a concrete example here, like if you have students and they have student awards, like all of those funding IDs, you're very rarely going to have one project funding ID tied to one RAID because there are just so many personnel questions and you're using part of a grant and you're collaborating with someone in another country and they're using part of their grant and your students all have their own student awards and maybe they're internal university awards or maybe they are funded by a national funding agency, but no matter what, like projects are complicated and a big container to capture so many things, like Sheila said, dynamically. So even if you have a project award, you're almost certainly working with students who have their own funding that could be included in a RAID as well.
And thanks for all the attention and questions about RAID. I know I saved that for the end. I've just put an FAQ into the chat if people want to take a look at that because I mean, yes, it is new. And so, yeah, if anybody has more thoughts or questions on it, let us know. Does anybody have any other questions about anything else we talked about or things you're thinking about maybe at your own organization that you're grappling with or ideas that you might have related to what we've talked about today? We can also go back to the name versus identifier question for individuals too.
Well, I'm happy to quickly dig back into that one. one question or that discussion with Shlomi and Dana. Um, It's a really good question, right? Because PIDs are alphanumeric codes. They are purposefully supposed to not be semantically legible. This is particularly important because names change. So, even in a DOI, sometimes you wind up seeing a DOI suffix that lists an abbreviation of the name of a journal. And guess what? That journal has changed its name, but you're stuck with that semantic piece of information. The whole point is that the number should not be semantically legible. It should be machine readable and random. Uh, but then, of course, there is this question of people are people, and we don't want to be dehumanizing by feeling like we are simply barcoding them. It's one thing to barcode a publication, it's another thing to barcode a person, of course. And so we don't want ORCID IDs and PIDs for people to be disconnected from the person. The whole point is that they should be deeply and meaningfully connected to the person. That also known as field is one of the ways to really effectively get across changes across the lifespan of a person's name or different variations if you have different versions of your name in different languages. I don't use it professionally, but I have a Hebrew name. I could technically use that somewhere, and maybe I should add that to my ORCID record. But if you're publishing in different bodies of work in different languages, ORCID has the ability to reflect those things. So although the alphanumeric code is just a semantically illegible number, and names are a bad way to identify you, it's the connection between those two things that's what makes PIDs valuable. Saying this person with these many different versions of their name, this is where we can find them, right here.
Yes, the floor is open for questions and comments. So if anybody does have something they'd like to add to the conversation, please feel free to unmute or put it into the chat. We have a few more minutes left in the session. I'm seeing a new comment on the thread from Chris. Basically, for human legibility, it's important to continue to include the author's name in citations. Interesting. And then let's see, I've got some other comments in the chat here. Some universities are considering measuring research outputs. How can PIDs help with that initiative? I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by measuring research outputs. So just trying to get a handle on what and how many research outputs are coming out of work that's affiliated with the university. PIDs can absolutely help with that as long as all of the metadata is there. For example, with DOIs for publications, as long as you've got the ORCID IDs and ROR IDs of the people and organizations that are behind that work. Basically, all of the open PID providers, so ORCID, DataCite, Crossref, ROR, for example, they all have open metadata and APIs where you can query to find all of the DOIs that have your organization's ROR ID included in the metadata as affiliations for the contributors. So PIDs can play a big role in that. And of course, also pulling works out of people's ORCID records, but we have to make sure that all that metadata is there before you can use that metadata to find this information. So yeah, there's a lot of potential there. And I'm seeing some questions about, Library of Congress IDs. Are they considered PIDs? I think this is a good opportunity to mention there are a lot of identifiers out there that may or may not be considered persistent identifiers. One of the things that we're working on in the US right now with NISO, our National Information Standards Organization, is it's called a US National PID Strategies Working Group, and we're actively, I'm part of that group, and I think there's some others on the call that I recognize from the group. We're actively working on their stakeholders from, all different perspectives, and we're coming up with an agreed upon definition of what a PID is. It has to be unique. It has to be resolvable. Um, it has to have certain metadata behind it, all of these things. So that work is underway. I know other countries, Canada included, have come up with their own national PID strategies and things like that. So that's, I think, a question that is under discussion right now, and is going to depend on the definition in your context, the definition of a PID. We have about a few minutes left. Are there any burning questions or comments? Absolutely. Paolo just put into the chat the email addresses for ORCID US community and also ORCID-CA. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. Thanks again so much, everyone, for joining us for this discussion today. I hope it was thought-provoking and helped you gain some insight. And we will be sharing this recording, slides, and helpful resources shortly. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.